Hey there, Wranglers. Welcome to another roundup. Today's video is by request by one of my users, and so we'll be talking about that, and it's about the Fae Folk, the fairies, and those kind of things. I don't have any updates on the crime case yet that I had mentioned in one previous video, but today we're talking about the Fae, and this is going to be a little longer video than normal because there's a lot to talk about here, and so grab a snack, grab a beverage of your choice, or grab any one of your favorite vices, or it could be healthy. I don't care. Grab it. Sit tight, and I'm going to tell you about the Fae. Now, the Fae, the fairy folk, these enchanted creatures, and all that. You start reading about them, you start digging into this, and it says, "Oh, the Fae folk means the good folk," and then the next sentence will say, "Well, they're not all good," which is very true. In fact, throughout most of history, most of these things were pretty bad. Okay, and had some sinister undertones to just about every single one of the ones that we think about as darling and cute and all that, and all this kind of thing. And I'm basically been doing my research about when these things were, what people thought of these things in, I want to say, even ancient times to, old times to whatever, and not necessarily what people think claim to say about them today, because it seems like a lot of people make up their own stuff about anything they want, and that they're free to do that. But I'm going to report to you the historical part. Now, this is a fairy right here. She's very pretty, and I love this style of painting. This is the pre-Raphaelite style, I do believe. And painting was done in 1800s, and I forget the lady's name, but I'll dig that up for you. Anyway, the lady that painted this. Let's start with one of the most strange cases. And forgive the glare on my glasses. I got a lot of notes here to read, so I'm gonna look a little bit like Grandpa today. So anyway, okay. The first story I want to tell you about is the Green Children of Woolpit. And here's how the story goes. This one day, somebody was out wandering around the town of Woolpit, which is short for Wolf Pit, and they found these two children, and they were green. They had a green texture, not a green texture, a green color to their skin. These children were brought back and didn't eat for days until they found raw broad beans and started eating these raw beans. And as they started eating the food from the village, they started to lose their green color and eventually gained a normal color. And unfortunately, right after they were baptized, the young boy died. The girl grew up, and she was, I'm going to say hell on wheels. They keep referring to her as impudent and wanton. So think about that. She was a servant for a big high nobleman, and she was very impudent and wanton. But the children, that's when she was an adult or young lady, and as she was growing. But the children claimed to come from a place called St. Martin's Land, where the sun never quite shone, and everything was green, and it was like twilight all the time, and that's where they claim they came from. They don't know how they got to get back. They just said one day they were out playing, or not playing, excuse me, herding their father's cattle. They heard a bell chime, and next thing you know, they were by the wolf pit, and where they were found. Here's the sign of the wolf pit right now. This is their little logo, their mascot for that town of Woolpit. Okay, got the little wolf, got them kids, and so the legend is, in the way it's helped the town. Now, there's a lot of logical explanations for this, and we could get into a bunch of them. I read a bunch, and different afflictions they could have had and all this, but they tell the same strange story about St. Martin's Land and some other things. But they think that this story kind of persisted for hundreds of years, according to credible sources too. And I read about it, a lot of the different things they could have had, or where they were from, or whatever. Some people think they were aliens. Some people think they were something different. But it's very possible this story was twisted. At the time, the Flemish and the Brits, the Anglicans, didn't get along so well, and these kids showed up looking very different in Danish clothes and all that kind of thing, and were taken in by the village, and grew up in the village and that kind of thing. Now they were probably could have been lost Danish kids and maybe very pale from in pallor compared to the Englishmen and all that kind of thing, and they they grew up that way. That's, I think, one of the that probably is the origin. Well, in my opinion, the origin of the story, or they could have really been from some mysterious place called St. Martin's Land. If St. Martin's Land's out there, I want to visit it because it sounds like my kind of place. I love the twilight. I love the trees. I love I love the love that time of day, and I could live in that forever. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about are the Cottingley fairies. Okay, yeah, long time ago, 1800s, 1888 or so, around that time. These two ladies, it was, excuse me, 1901 to 1988. I'm sorry, 1907 to 9. Oh, they live. Oh, that's, I'm sorry, that was they given their birth dates, but no, this happened around 1888 when Sherlock Holmes was being written, and let me explain why that's important. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was heavily involved in this case. These girls claimed to actually have photographed these fairies dancing around with them and playing with them. And these photographs spread throughout Britain like crazy, and it was proof that fairies were real and that these girls could, they were interacting with these girls. And the two girls were Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, Frances Griffith actually died in 1986, and Elsie Wright died in 1988. So this had to have happened before 1888 because they were born in 1901 and one in 1907. So forgive my date mistake there. They were born. This probably happened in the right after World War One or so, right around that time. And the when this was getting spread around. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a huge mysticist, was into this. Unlike his famous character, who was devoted to logic and reason and brilliance, Sherlock Holmes. Now, forgive me for getting those dates wrong initially, but these were the Cottingley fairies. And if you look pretty close, I'll give you a minute to look. Would you have been fooled by this? I don't know. Maybe we would have been fooled at the time. But these are clearly what they are is what they look like. These were drawings the girls took from books, and they cut them out, and they drew some of them themselves and cut them out. Some of them they cut out of these books, cut them out, used long hat pins to stick them into the cutouts into the ground, and then looked admiringly at the fairies and made the little fairy party dancing around. And that was enough at the time to convince people that fairies were real. These were the Fae Folk. We're going to get into quote unquote real fairies eventually here. The so this is kind of one of the hoaxes that we discussed. Now, one of the creepy things we talk about, and let me tell. I'm getting into a creepy story here. This is the story of the Earl King, and the Earl King is a Danish. Basically, it kind of is a Danish word, and they thought it stood for the fairy king, or it could have slightly meant that the fairy king, but most likely Earl, others contend heavily, and I believe them, that it's not just Earl King, it's Elf King. Okay, now we live in a world where people play, online MMOs, and they play Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, and we've seen, Legolas and all the elves in Lord of the Rings and how high and noble they are, and how tall the Nordic and all that, and the Nordic legends even have the high elves and the dark elves and the light elves and this kind of thing. But the Danish, and then in this Germanic Danish tradition, the elves were not dark or light, they were bad. They were tall, thin, slender, gaunt. They were evil. They were the undead. And the Earl King's job was to seduce people over to the side. And the Earl King is made famous in a poem by Goethe, where he talks about a father riding with his child, trying to get home. And the child keeps hearing the Earl King beckoning him, my child, come with me. Such games we'll play, such sights we'll see. And he's like, Father, Father, do you not hear the Earl King whispering in my ear? And like for the father, Son, I see what you say. It's the willows, the wind blowing the willows in their branches of gray. And it goes on like that till the father crosses this bridge trying to get home. And as soon as he arrives home, the boy has died. The Earl King has won. And this is another painting of the Earl King, and you can see the fella and his son there on the horse, and this is the Earl King pursuing them, calling to the child. These are his daughters. The Earl King's daughters are promising to take care of the kid and make him clothes of gold and play with him night and day and make his life heaven. And they're all trying to bring him to the not dark side really. Well, maybe it is, but try to bring him to the undead world. They're trying to get the child's soul. They're trying to pull him into the afterlife. These were the elves in the Germanic tradition. So next time you strap uh, on MMO, you strap up your gear and all that kind of thing, and you're thinking about being this high noble elf, consider this: that two-thirds of your tradition were evil. With the light, we had the light elves were good, and then we had the dark elves in Nordic history, which were bad and dark, and then we had these Germanic slash Danish slash Nordic elves that were the undead and tried to bring people into their things. So these are elves. These are what people thought of them for years, and who knows? Maybe it is the elves that call us to the next side. Maybe that is what the bright light is. But this is the Earl King himself. This is a picture of the Earl King and his daughters, which I think is pretty fascinating. And I tried to draw from old sources. I wanted to see it. The reason I'm choosing a lot of these old pictures is I wanted to kind of get into the mindset of the people of the ancient, or that's not even a word, of the older traditions and the ancient traditions of what they thought were the original traditions of these creatures, these mysterious, very mystical beings, of how they were perceived. And so these older paintings and older drawings, I think, maybe they may not be as technically advanced as some, except for maybe that pre-Raphaelite one, but they're an interesting look into that time period. It's the best we got as a time machine. The next one I want to talk about is something else that fairies did. Your lovely fairies, changelings. Okay, it's an ugly baby. All right, but never tell anybody their baby's ugly. A changeling. What is a changeling? Well, the fairies would come and they would exchange a fairy child for a human child. Often they would do that with a sickly fairy child and let him be raised by humans, or her be raised by humans and die. And the fairies would have taken the human child and raised it as a fairy, and or whatever magic they used on him. But they would swap out your baby from maybe a healthy one to a sickly one, and stealing your children. That's the changelings. There's a few stories of these things, but that was this was the fairies, one of the fairies' main domains, one of their main how do you say it? This is one of the things they did a lot. So this is a changeling. Obviously, you see this thing in your crib, you're gonna wonder. But at least this is gonna leave an impression on you. Okay. So that's a changeling. Now we talk about pixies and brownies and fairies and stuff like that. And some fairies were known as house fairies. I think those were the brownies, and then you had pixies, and lots of different types of these creatures. And here's a young man talking to a pixie, and the pixies could fly, and were very they're tricksters. They were they could be very, and you don't want to piss them off. Could be very evil to you. Tinkerbell was a pixie and a fairy kind of thing, and she was cute. She'd get all flustered and stuff like that. But in their tradition, pixies weren't something even though they're cute and they could fly and all that, they were to be avoided because they were dangerous if they chose to be. And I don't know what him and this kid are talking about, but well, he's probably making a mistake talking to this pixie here. And so there's lots of different types of fairy folk, and I could go on. I mean, we could probably go on for hours talking about them, but I got a little dance here going on. We got goblins and no, I don't know, even gnomish looking things and demonic looking things, and different types of fae that are standing here, maybe good and evil, and then Tommy knockers is something I wanted to bring up. We have dwarves and gnomes and all that, but I chose to talk about a little bit about Tommy knockers. They're creatures that live in mines, small things, and miners claim to have could hear them at night or whenever they were active or stuff like that. And I had a girlfriend once, and her dad who was a retired police officer, but before that had worked in some mines, claimed these things were real. And it wasn't uncommon for a Tommyknocker to try to help miners. I mean, if there was something going on, there's tales of miners actually being, even up to modern times, warned by these things to get out, and these things actually showing themselves and telling them to leave because there was danger in the mines. But I included this, like I said, because it's interesting, because I've got I've met a person myself who claims he believes in them, and I'd consider him a credible source, being a police officer and being on the force for as many years as he was, and an entire career and retired. So here, consider your Tommy knockers. They're one of the good. It sounds like they're one of the good ones. The next we have are the Jinn. However you want to spell it, Djinn, Jin, whatever. Genies, the Jinn, the creatures made of fire from the Middle East. A Jinn was made of fire and shadow and smoke, and they're the ones that would grant excuse me, wishes, and had a lot of the magical properties that we see some of these other creatures have. But yes, as it was explained, they were made of flame, and they were terrifying, and they their domain was the desert, and you wouldn't want to run across a Jinn in most places, in most cases, because not only were they, a lot of them, tricksters, but they're very dangerous. They usually, an encounter with a Jinn would not end well. And this is an old illustration of what these things, how these things were perceived and thought about, and that kind of thing. So the Jinn were another one of I can include them in the fairy folk, or Fae Folk, as you call it, because of, not only do we all know who they are, but because of the mysterious nature of them, being made of fire, being able to grant wishes, being dangerous as they are. So there they are. There's the Jinn. And next I brought up, I don't know if this is really a Fae folk, but the Banshees. Scotland, Ireland told the story about a banshee, and a banshee's wail that, signifies an omen of death coming. If you hear a banshee out screaming, you know that death is soon to follow. And you can see this one here, and then we got ruins of a castle, and maybe she knows of a victim that she's about ready to take out, or not take out, but blast the banshee's wail, and so that the mortals hear it and know that death is coming and on their way. Would you consider a banshee good or bad? I don't know. Terrifying is more the word that it seems like they said. Nobody seemed to think of banshees as a good thing. They thought of them as a terrifying, disturbing monstrosity. Okay, so here's a banshee, and again, an old illustration, and I thought this was kind of well done, and again gives us a window into what they were thinking back then. We got the cool little moon over there, and the castle, and nice. This would be cool if we could colorize it a little bit and make it a Halloween pick. And finally, I want to come to the goblins. Okay, here's a goblin. In fact, this is a Goblin King. We think of goblins as bad usually, but for most of their history, goblins were actually one of the good ones. Okay, one of the goblins' main jobs, according to research, was to help parents discipline their children. If the children were bad, the goblins would sometimes interfere and pranks and do things to the children that would scare them, or frighten them a little bit, or spook them out to get them to listen to the parents. Or if the kids were good, sometimes the goblins would leave them gifts and go on about their way. Now there's probably the different kinds of goblins have evolved up into now, and goblins are just kind of silly, and goblins, and in Tolkien's work, where we saw what he thought of elves and all that, and the dwarves and all that. You can see good examples of goblins in when they're in the mines of Moria. Those things down there were the ones with the big black eyes, and those were the goblins. The smaller ones with the big black eyes, and we're scaling down the sides of the thing. And then we have the goblins in the Hobbit weren't that well done. They were just kind of like poor orcs, but I always thought there was a nice distinction between goblins and orcs in the Lord of the Rings, even though a lot of people will say they're the same. They're very similar in that in that book. But this is a historical goblin. Again, a nice drawing of a give you the spirit, the goblin spirit there, so that you have it and see how they perceived it. And he's got his dunce cap on, or whatever that is, a little pointed cap, and his cape or wings or what have you. But anyway, that's my discussion of the Fae Folk, and you know, this is a topic that you could go on for hours of all these different things. If I forgot one, ask me about it. Feel free to comment, and I'd really appreciate comments and subscribe to the channel. It costs nothing. Like the video and enjoy yourself. And thank you for sticking with me today. And I want to thank some people, specifically, my forum that has been faithful to me for 20 years. You know, we support each other in a very rough way, but they still support. I want to shout out to them. I'm not gonna. It's the MISC. You'll find it. So shout out to the MISC, and then they. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say today, and I'm gonna let you go, and that's about it. Hey, keep on riding, keep on wrangling, and I'll see you at the next roundup. Bye bye.